Dorothy Ainsworth clutched her wedding bouquet so tightly that the stems snapped beneath her trembling fingers, the sweet scent of prairie wildflowers mingling with the bitter tang of disappointment that hung in the air. Spring Creek, Wyoming Territory, 1875, was supposed to be the beginning of her new life, not another dead end on a journey already marked by too many broken promises. The small town's white clapboard church stood against the vast Wyoming sky, its modest steeple pointing accusingly toward heaven as if demanding an explanation for the day's cruel turn. Inside, 24 townsfolk shifted uncomfortably in the pews, their whispers growing louder with each passing minute. The bride stood alone at the altar, the empty space beside her a glaring reminder that Arthur Caldwell, the man who had answered her advertisement in the matrimonial news, the man who had promised her a home and future, was nowhere to be found. "Miss Ainsworth," Reverend Porter said gently, his weathered face creased with concern. "Perhaps we should, just a few more minutes," Dorothy insisted, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions threatening to overwhelm her. 22 years old, and already she had lost her parents to influenza, her family home to debt, and now her last chance at security to a man who couldn't even be bothered to show up to his own wedding. "He'll come." But the minutes ticked by, marked by the steady rhythm of the church clock and the increasingly pitying glances from the assembled guests. When the church door finally creaked open an hour past the appointed time, Dorothy's heart leapt only to plummet again when Arthur Caldwell's business partner, not Arthur himself, entered. "I'm afraid I have some news," the man announced, his eyes avoiding Dorothy's. "Mr. Caldwell left town on the morning stage. He left this for the bride." He held out a sealed envelope. The letter, when Dorothy finally forced herself to open it with shaking hands, was brief and cruel in its simplicity. "Changed my mind, don't want a wife after all. Passage home enclosed." The church fell silent. Dorothy stood frozen, the letter clutched in one hand, her wilting bouquet in the other. The weight of 24 pairs of eyes pressed upon her, and she felt herself beginning to crumble beneath their collective pity. Then a chair scraped against the wooden floor. A tall figure rose from the back pew, where the shadows had kept him partially hidden throughout the proceedings. Dorothy watched as a man she had never seen before made his way down the aisle with the unhurried confidence of someone who knew exactly what he was doing, even if no one else did. He was unmistakably a cowboy, from his well-worn boots to his sun-bronzed face. His dark hair was a touch too long, curling slightly at the collar of his shirt, which was clean but showed signs of hasty pressing. His eyes, when they met hers, were a startling blue against his tanned skin. "Miss Ainsworth," he said, removing his hat as he approached the altar. His voice was low and rough, like coffee brewed over a campfire. "My name is Jack Reeves. I work at the Silver Creek Ranch outside of town." He paused, seeming to consider his next words carefully. "I don't know you and you don't know me, but no woman deserves to be treated the way you've been treated today." Dorothy stared at him, bewildered by this unexpected interruption to her humiliation. "Mr. Reeves, I appreciate your concern, but I'm not offering pity, madam," he said, his eyes never leaving hers. "I'm offering a solution." A murmur rippled through the church as the townsfolk leaned forward, suddenly finding this turn of events far more interesting than their previous discomfort. "What kind of solution?" Dorothy asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jack Reeves took a deep breath. "A marriage, not out of love, we're strangers after all, but out of respect and practicality. I have a small homestead that needs a woman's touch. You need a home and a name." "It's not romantic, but it's honest." Dorothy blinked, certain she had misheard him. "You want to marry me? Now, you don't even know me." "I know enough," he replied simply. "I know you're brave enough to travel across the country to marry a man you'd never met. I know you're holding yourself together right now when most would have collapsed, and I know that Caldwell was a fool." The Reverend cleared his throat. "Mr. Reeves, while I admire your chivalry, marriage is a sacred institution, not something to be entered into on a whim. With all due respect, Reverend, there's nothing whimsical about my offer." Jack's eyes remained fixed on Dorothy. Miss Ainsworth came here expecting to be married today. She has no home to return to, isn't that right, Miss? Dorothy nodded numbly. That's correct. And I came to town today intending to post an advertisement for a mail-order bride myself, Jack continued. Seems to me this saves us both the trouble and expense. The logic of it was undeniable, but Dorothy's mind was spinning. Marrying a complete stranger had been her plan all along, of course, but she'd exchanged letters with Arthur for months. She knew nothing about this man except his name and occupation. Mr. Reeves, she began carefully, your offer is unexpected and kind in its way. But I can't possibly, you can, he interrupted, his voice gentle but firm. And if you find after a month that you can't bear the arrangement, I'll pay your way to wherever you wish to go. No questions asked. Dorothy looked past him to the congregation. Some faces showed shock, others curiosity, and a few, particularly among the older women, showed something like approval. Why? She asked finally, turning back to the cowboy. Why would you do this for a stranger? Something flickered across his face, a shadow of memory, perhaps, or an old pain. Because 8 years ago, my sister found herself in a similar situation. No one stood up for her. He paused. I wasn't there to help her then, but I'm here now. Dorothy studied him, searching for any sign of deception or ill intent, but found only steady resolve in his clear blue eyes. She thought of the alternatives, returning east in defeat, penniless and humiliated, or trying to make her way alone in this frontier town where she knew no one. Very well, Mr. Reeves, she said at last, her voice stronger than she expected. I accept your proposal. A collective gasp rose from the pews, followed by a buzz of excited whispers. The Reverend looked between them, clearly conflicted. Are you certain about this, Miss Ainsworth? Dorothy nodded, surprised to find that she was, not happy, perhaps not relieved, but certain. I am, and you, Mr. Reeves? I am, Jack confirmed, his expression solemn. The Reverend sighed. Then I suppose we have a wedding to perform after all. And so, with the same witnesses who had gathered to see her marry another man, Dorothy Ainsworth became Mrs. Jack Reeves in a ceremony that lasted less than 10 minutes. When the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, Jack did not kiss her but merely offered his arm. Shall we, Mrs. Reeves? He asked quietly. Dorothy placed her hand on his arm, feeling the solid strength beneath the worn fabric of his sleeve. We shall, Mr. Reeves. As they walked back down the aisle together, Dorothy caught fragments of whispered conversations. Never seen anything like it. Poor girl. That Reeves always was an odd one. Wonder how long it'll last. Outside, the afternoon sun was bright and unforgiving, illuminating the reality of what she had just done. She had married a man she had known for less than an hour, a man whose home she had never seen, whose character was a mystery. But as Jack helped her into his wagon and climbed up beside her, Dorothy felt a strange calm settle over her. I hope you won't regret this, Mr. Reeves, she said as they pulled away from the church. Jack glanced at her, his expression unreadable. Call me Jack, and regret is a luxury for people with too much time on their hands. We've got a farm to run. As the wagon rattled through town and out onto the open road, Dorothy Ainsworth Reeves tossed her wilted bouquet into the dust behind them and faced forward, toward whatever future awaited her with this enigmatic cowboy who had become her husband in the most unexpected way imaginable. The journey to Jack's homestead took nearly 2 hours, the wagon bouncing over rutted trails that gradually climbed into rolling foothills. They traveled mostly in silence, the occasional comment about the weather or landscape serving as the only interruption to the rhythmic creaking of the wagon wheels and the steady clip-clop of the horses' hooves. Dorothy used the time to study her new husband surreptitiously. His profile was strong, straight nose, firm jaw shadowed with stubble, and eyes that seemed to constantly scan the horizon. His hands, holding the reins with casual expertise, were calloused and strong. Everything about him spoke of hard work and self-reliance. Just over this next rise, Jack said finally, breaking a lengthy silence. Dorothy straightened, eager for her first glimpse of her new home. As they crested the hill, a small valley opened before them, cradled by gentle slopes covered in spring grass and wildflowers. A creek, glinting silver in the late afternoon sun, cut through the center of the property. Near its bank stood a modest cabin with a porch spanning its front, smoke curling lazily from the stone chimney. Beyond the cabin were a barn, a corral with several horses, and fenced pastures where cattle grazed. "It's not much," Jack said, misinterpreting her silence as disappointment. "But the land is good. The creek never runs dry, even in August." "It's beautiful," Dorothy replied honestly. After the crowded tenements of Boston, where she had worked as a seamstress following her parents' deaths, this open space and clean air seemed like paradise. Jack nodded, seeming pleased but uncomfortable with her praise. He guided the wagon down the slope and across a simple wooden bridge spanning the creek. As they approached the cabin, Dorothy noticed details she had missed from a distance: the small vegetable garden to one side, the chopping block and woodpile, the rocking chair on the porch. Before they reached the yard, the cabin door swung open and an older woman emerged, shading her eyes against the setting sun. "That's Mrs. Holloway," Jack explained. "She comes from town twice a week to help with cleaning and such. I sent word to her this morning that I might be bringing back a bride, though I confess, I didn't expect things to happen quite this way." The wagon pulled to a stop, and Mrs. Holloway approached, her round face alight with curiosity. She was a small woman, plump and gray-haired, with kind eyes that assessed Dorothy with undisguised interest. "So you did find yourself a wife," she exclaimed, looking from Jack to Dorothy. "And a pretty one at that." Jack jumped down from the wagon and came around to help Dorothy descend. His hands at her waist were firm but respectful as he lifted her to the ground. "Mrs. Holloway, this is Dorothy," he said. "My wife." The words sounded strange to Dorothy's ears, as strange, she imagined, as they must have sounded to Jack. "Pleased to meet you, Mrs. Holloway," Dorothy said, extending her hand. Mrs. Holloway bypassed the offered hand entirely and enveloped Dorothy in a warm hug that smelled of baking bread and lavender sachets. "Oh, welcome, dear. We've been hoping Jack would find someone. This place needs a woman's touch, something fierce." "Thank you," Dorothy replied, somewhat overwhelmed by the enthusiastic greeting. "I've got supper nearly ready," Mrs. Holloway continued, ushering them toward the cabin. "And I aired out the house, changed the bedding, and put fresh flowers in your room, your room." The phrase hit Dorothy with unexpected force. She would be sharing a bedroom, sharing a bed with this man she barely knew. A flush crept up her neck at the thought. Jack must have sensed her discomfort. "Dorothy's had a long day, Mrs. Holloway. Perhaps you could show her where she can freshen up while I see to the horses." Of course," Mrs. Holloway agreed, taking Dorothy's arm. "Come along, dear, I'll show you around." The cabin was small but well built, with a main room that served as both kitchen and living area, dominated by a large stone fireplace. A sturdy table with 4 chairs stood in the center, already set for supper. Off this main room were 2 doors, one leading to a pantry and the other to the bedroom. "Jack built most of this place himself," Mrs. Holloway explained proudly as she showed Dorothy around. "Started with just a 1-room shelter and kept adding. He's always been good with his hands." The bedroom was simply furnished with a large bed covered in a patchwork quilt, a chest of drawers, a washstand with a pitcher and basin, and a small dressing table with a mirror. A vase of wildflowers sat on the chest, adding a touch of color to the plain room. "I'll leave you to get settled," Mrs. Holloway said, patting Dorothy's hand. "There's warm water in the pitcher and I put some towels there on the stand. Supper will be ready soon." When the older woman had gone, Dorothy sank onto the edge of the bed, the events of the day finally catching up with her. That morning, she had dressed with trembling excitement, expecting to marry Arthur Caldwell, a man she knew only through letters but had convinced herself she could love. Now, as the sun set on this strange day, she was Mrs. Jack Reeves, married to a man she had met mere hours ago. Dorothy stood and moved to the washstand, pouring water into the basin. She splashed her face, the cool water reviving her somewhat, then unbraided and rebraided her chestnut hair. The face that looked back at her from the mirror was familiar, yet somehow different. The same green eyes and straight nose, the same stubborn chin. but there was a new wariness in her expression, a guardedness that hadn't been there that morning. By the time she emerged from the bedroom, Jack had returned from the barn and was washing his hands at the kitchen pump. Mrs. Holloway was bustling about, placing a steaming pot of stew on the table alongside a loaf of fresh bread. "There she is," Mrs. Holloway exclaimed. "Come sit down, dear." "You must be famished." Jack pulled out a chair for Dorothy, the gesture automatic but polite. As they settled around the table, an awkward silence fell. Mrs. Holloway, seemingly oblivious to the tension, chattered happily as she served the stew. "This is the last of last fall's preserves," she said, placing a dish of stewed apples on the table. "But soon enough we'll have fresh fruit again. Do you know much about preserving, Dorothy?" "Yes, my mother taught me," Dorothy replied, grateful for the safe topic. "We used to put up peaches and pears every autumn." "Wonderful. Jack's got some fine apple trees just coming into their prime, and wild berries grow all along the creek. We'll have plenty to work with come harvest time." Dorothy nodded, trying to imagine herself still here in autumn, making this place her home. It seemed both impossible and inevitable. They ate mostly in silence after that, the stew hearty and flavorful after Dorothy's day of nervous fasting. She was acutely aware of Jack across the table, the careful way he broke his bread, the strength in his forearms as he reached for the salt, the occasional glances he cast her way when he thought she wasn't looking. When the meal was finished, Mrs. Holloway insisted on clearing up alone. "You two have plenty to talk about, I expect," she said with a knowing smile that made Dorothy blush again. "I'll just tidy up and be on my way. My son's coming to fetch me shortly." Left alone with Jack at the table, Dorothy struggled to find words. It was Jack who finally broke the silence. "I want you to know," he said quietly, "that I meant what I said in town. If this arrangement doesn't suit you after a month, I'll see you safely wherever you want to go." Dorothy met his gaze directly. "And if it doesn't suit you," a faint smile touched his lips. "I'm not in the habit of breaking my word, Mrs. Reeves." "Nor am I, Mr. Reeves," she replied. "I've agreed to be your wife, and I'll do my best to be a good one. And I'll try to be a good husband," he said simply. "But there are things you should know about me in this place." He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. "I'm not a wealthy man. The ranch turns a profit, but a modest one. I can provide for you comfortably enough, but there won't be many luxuries." Dorothy nodded. "I didn't come west expecting luxury." "No, I suppose you didn't." He studied her for a moment. "May I ask why you did come? Why a mail-order marriage?" It was a fair question, one Dorothy had asked herself many times on the long journey west. "After my parents died, I worked as a seamstress in Boston. The pay was poor, the hours long, and there was no future in it." She looked down at her hands, still bearing the tiny scars of 1,000 needle pricks. "When I saw Arthur's advertisement when he wrote about his mercantile business and the growing town and the need for a practical, hard-working wife, it seemed like Providence." "I'm sorry it didn't work out as you planned," Jack said, his voice genuinely sympathetic. Dorothy looked up at him. "Is that why you were in town today, to place an advertisement for a bride?" He nodded. "As Mrs. Holloway is fond of reminding me, a ranch needs a woman's touch, and I—" He trailed off, seeming uncomfortable. "I've been alone a long time." Before Dorothy could respond, the sound of a wagon approaching announced Mrs. Holloway's son's arrival. The older woman emerged from the kitchen, drying her hands on her apron. "Well, that's me done for the day," she announced. "I've left everything tidy, and there's bread dough rising for the morning. I'll be back on Wednesday as usual unless you'd rather I didn't." This last question was directed at Dorothy, who quickly shook her head. "Please, I'd welcome your help and company while I learn my way around, Mrs." Holloway beamed. "Wonderful, and don't you worry about a thing, dear. Jack's a good man." She lowered her voice conspiratorially. "A bit quiet, but good clean through," after bidding Mrs. Holloway goodbye from the porch. Dorothy and Jack stood side by side, watching the wagon disappear down the road. The evening was settling around them, the first stars appearing in the deepening blue of the sky. The air was cool and sweet with the scent of pine and sage. "I should check on the animals once more before turning in," Jack said. Would you like to come along, see the rest of the place? Dorothy nodded, grateful for the postponement of the inevitable awkwardness of bedtime. I'd like that. Jack showed her the barn, first a solid structure housing 4 milk cows, a pen of chickens, and additional stalls for the draft horses. A loft above was stacked with sweet-smelling hay. Outside, he pointed out the boundaries of his property, the best fishing spots along the creek and the distant mountains that turned purple in the fading light. It's all so vast, Dorothy murmured, taking in the expansive landscape. That bothers some people, Jack said, the openness. The silence. Dorothy shook her head. Not me, it's freeing somehow. He glanced at her with what might have been approval. Yes, that's how I've always felt about it. By the time they returned to the cabin, full darkness had fallen. Jack lit the lamps while Dorothy stood awkwardly in the center of the room, uncertain what to do next. I'll sleep in the barn tonight, Jack said abruptly, solving the immediate dilemma. Give you time to settle in. Relief and an unexpected twinge of disappointment mingled in Dorothy's chest. That's not necessary. I don't want to put you out of your own bed. It's our bed now, he corrected her gently. But I think we both need time to get used to that idea. He moved to the chest in the corner and took out a blanket. I'll be comfortable enough in the hayloft. Done it plenty of times during calving season. Dorothy wanted to object further but found she couldn't. The thought of sharing a bed with this stranger, husband or not, was too overwhelming after the emotional tumult of the day. Thank you, she said simply. Jack nodded. I rise early usually with the sun, but sleep as long as you need tomorrow. Everything will keep. He moved toward the door, then paused. Dorothy, he said, the first time he had used her given name, I want you to know that I respect the vows we took today. I'll be a proper husband to you in all ways, but only when you're ready, not before. The sincerity in his voice brought unexpected tears to Dorothy's eyes. Thank you, Jack. He gave her a brief nod, then slipped out the door, leaving Dorothy alone in the quiet cabin. She moved slowly through her evening routine, washing up and changing into her nightgown behind the privacy screen in the bedroom. The bed, when she finally slipped beneath the quilt, was comfortable but strange, too large for one person. Yet she found herself keeping strictly to one side, as if preserving the other for its rightful occupant. As she lay in the darkness, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of her new home, the distant lowing of cattle, the rustle of wind in the pines, the occasional hoot of an owl, Dorothy tried to make sense of the day's extraordinary turn of events. She had come to Wyoming to marry a shopkeeper and instead had become the wife of a rancher. She had expected to share a bed with Arthur Caldwell tonight and instead was alone in Jack Reeves's cabin. Life, it seemed, had a way of appending the most carefully laid plans. As Dorothy drifted toward sleep, she wondered what other surprises awaited her in this new life she had stumbled into, and whether, against all odds, it might yet turn out to be the answer to her prayers. Dawn broke clear and golden over the Silver Creek Ranch, bathing the cabin in soft light that filtered through the simple cotton curtains. Dorothy woke slowly, momentarily disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings until the events of the previous day came rushing back. She was married. She was in Wyoming. She was Dorothy Reeves now. The cabin was quiet save for the cheerful chirping of birds outside and the distant sounds of activity from the direction of the barn. Jack was already up and working, just as he had said he would be. Dorothy rose quickly, chiding herself for oversleeping on her first morning as a rancher's wife. What must he think of her, lying abed while he labored? She dressed hastily in one of her plainer dresses, a practical blue cotton that had weathered the journey west better than most of her garments, and twisted her hair into a simple knot at the nape of her neck. There was no time for vanity this morning. She had a household to learn and work to do. In the main room, she found the fire already lit in the stove and a pot of coffee keeping warm. A note in a firm, masculine hand sat propped against the coffee pot. Breakfast in the warming oven. Take your time. Jay, the thoughtfulness of the gesture touched her. Dorothy poured herself a cup of coffee and discovered freshly baked bread and a plate of eggs in the warming oven. As she ate, she took stock of her new domain, noting with approval the solid construction of the cabin and the practical arrangement of the kitchen area. It was a bachelor's home, certainly functional rather than comfortable, with few decorative touches, but it was clean and well-maintained. After breakfast, Dorothy explored more thoroughly, opening cupboards and drawers to familiarize herself with the household's contents. The pantry was well stocked with staples: flour, sugar, coffee, dried beans, and preserved fruits and vegetables. Hooks along one wall held various tools and implements, while shelves stacked neatly with crockery lined the opposite side. A trapdoor in the floor revealed a small root cellar containing potatoes, onions, and winter apples that were beginning to wrinkle, but were still sound. Satisfied with her inventory of the kitchen, Dorothy moved to investigate the rest of the cabin. A small bookcase in the main room held a surprising variety of volumes, practical guides to ranching and animal husbandry, of course, but also several works of history, a Bible, and dog-eared copies of Shakespeare and Dickens. So her new husband was a reader. This unexpected glimpse into Jack's inner life intrigued her. By mid-morning, Dorothy had familiarized herself with the cabin's contents and had begun making a mental list of small improvements she might implement. She was contemplating the best placement for her sewing machine, still packed in her trunk, when a knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. When she opened it, she found Jack on the porch, his hat in his hands. "Good morning," he said, a hint of uncertainty in his manner. "I hope you slept well." "Very well, thank you," Dorothy replied, "and thank you for breakfast. You didn't need to do that." Jack shrugged. "Seemed the least I could do." He gestured vaguely toward the barn. "I've been showing your trunks and things. Would you like me to bring them in now?" "Yes, please." "I was just thinking about where to set up my sewing machine." A look of pleased surprise crossed Jack's face. "You have a sewing machine? That'll be useful." "I was a seamstress in Boston," Dorothy explained. "I brought it thinking I might continue the work here, at least on a small scale." Jack nodded. "Good thinking. Nearest dressmaker is in town, and folks around here are always needing mending and such." Together, they carried Dorothy's belongings into the cabin, 2 trunks containing her clothes and personal items, a smaller case with her sewing notions, and the precious Singer machine, carefully crated for the journey. As they worked, Dorothy was struck by how naturally they fell into a rhythm together, anticipating each other's movements and needs with minimal conversation. "I thought I might show you around the property properly today," Jack said as they set the last trunk down, "if you're feeling up to it." "I'd like that," Dorothy replied. "Good, I need to finish the morning chores first, but after that." He trailed off, seeming uncertain again. "I could help with the chores," Dorothy offered. "I grew up helping my father with his workshop. I'm not afraid of work." Jack studied her for a moment, then nodded. "All right. There's an extra pair of boots by the door that might fit you. The ground can be uneven." The boots, which had belonged to Mrs. Holloway's daughter, were a bit large but serviceable with an extra pair of stockings. Dorothy followed Jack out to the barn, where he showed her how to feed and water the animals and explained the daily routine of the ranch. "The cattle mostly fend for themselves this time of year," he explained as they worked. "I've got about 60 head grazing in the north pasture. Come autumn, we'll drive most of them to market in Cheyenne, keeping just the breeding stock for next year." Dorothy listened attentively, asking questions when she didn't understand something and offering observations of her own. She was no stranger to hard work, but ranching was an entirely new world with its own vocabulary and rhythms. After the chores were completed, Jack saddled 2 horses, a sturdy bay gelding for himself and a gentle dun mare for Dorothy. "You ride?" he asked as he adjusted the stirrups for her. "A little," Dorothy admitted. "My uncle kept horses when I was a girl, but it's been years." "Daisy here is as gentle as they come," Jack assured her, patting the mare's neck. "She'll take good care of you." With Jack's help, Dorothy mounted the horse, arranging her skirts as modestly as possible. The side saddle she had expected to use had been damaged in transit, so she was riding astride, a position that felt scandalously improper but undeniably more secure. They rode out slowly, Jack pointing out the boundaries of his property, the best grazing areas, and the various outbuildings. The Silver Creek Ranch, Dorothy learned, encompassed just over 200 acres, with water rights to the creek that gave the property its name. My father staked the original claim, Jack explained as they rode along the creek bank. Came out here in '54 with nothing but a mule and a dream. Built the first cabin with his own hands, just a one-room affair where the barn stands now. And your mother? Dorothy asked. A shadow crossed Jack's face. She came later. Father went back east to find a bride in '56. They had a few good years together. He paused. She died bringing my sister into the world. I was 4. I'm sorry, Dorothy said softly. Jack nodded his acknowledgement of her sympathy. Father raised us as best he could. We were happy enough in our way. Then the war came. His expression grew distant. He joined up with a Wyoming cavalry unit in '62, never came home. Dorothy felt a pang of empathy. So you were left to raise your sister alone. From the time I was 14, Jack confirmed. Sarah was 10, we managed. They rode in silence for a while, climbing a gentle slope that offered a view of the entire valley. Jack reined in his horse at the crest, and Dorothy did the same, taking in the panorama before them, the silver ribbon of the creek winding through green pastures, the scattered cattle grazing peacefully, the cabin and outbuildings nestled against the backdrop of pine-covered hills. It's beautiful, Dorothy said sincerely. Jack nodded, a hint of pride in his expression. It's good land, not the biggest spread in the territory, but it's mine, ours now, free and clear. Dorothy glanced at him, struck by the amendment, ours. The word carried weight, a responsibility and promise she was only beginning to understand. Your sister, she said, returning to their earlier conversation. Where is she now? Jack's face darkened. Sarah's gone. She left when she was 18. Married a man passing through a gambler with smooth hands and smoother words. His jaw tightened. I tried to stop her, but she wouldn't listen. Last I heard, they were in California. And that's why you said what you did yesterday, Dorothy realized. About standing up for me because no one stood up for her. Jack nodded, his eyes on the distant mountains. I failed her, couldn't protect her from making a terrible mistake. He turned to look at Dorothy. When I saw you standing there alone in that church, it was like seeing Sarah all over again, another young woman about to be hurt by a man's carelessness. Dorothy held his gaze, understanding dawning. So you married me to save me. I married you because it seemed right, Jack corrected. For both of us. They rode back to the cabin in companionable silence, each lost in thought. The afternoon sun was warm on Dorothy's shoulders, and the gentle rhythm of the horse beneath her was soothing. Despite the strangeness of her situation, she felt an unexpected sense of peace. Back at the ranch, Jack helped her dismount, his hands strong and sure at her waist. For a brief moment, they stood close together, and Dorothy caught the scent of him, leather and sunshine and clean sweat. Then he stepped back, clearing his throat. I need to check the north pasture fence, he said. Won't be gone more than an hour or so. I'll have supper ready when you return, Dorothy promised. Alone in the cabin, Dorothy set about preparing their evening meal, finding comfort in the familiar tasks of cooking. She used ingredients from the well-stocked pantry to prepare a hearty stew, adding dumplings as her mother had taught her. As she worked, she reflected on what she had learned about Jack Reeves. He was a man shaped by loss and responsibility, someone who had shouldered adult burdens from a young age. His impulsive offer of marriage suddenly made more sense. It was an act of protection, born from his failure to protect his sister years before. But it was also, she sensed, an act of loneliness. Jack Reeves had been alone too long. By the time he returned, the cabin was filled with the savory aroma of simmering stew, and Dorothy had set the table with the cabin's plain but serviceable dishes, adding a small vase of wildflowers she had gathered near the porch as a centerpiece. Jack paused in the doorway, taking in the domestic scene with an expression Dorothy couldn't quite read. Smells good, he said finally, moving to wash his hands at the pump. They ate together at the table, the silence between them more comfortable than it had been the previous evening. Dorothy found herself watching Jack's hands as he broke his bread, strong, capable hands that had built this home and tended this land. This is delicious, Jack said, breaking into her thoughts. You're a fine cook." "Thank you," Dorothy replied, pleased by the compliment. "My mother believed every girl should know her way around a kitchen. Your mother sounds like a sensible woman." "She was." Dorothy smiled at the memory. Practical to her core, but with a romantic streak she tried to hide. She loved poetry, used to read Wordsworth and Keats aloud while she mended socks. Jack's expression softened. "My father was like that, tough as rawhide on the outside, but he'd sit by the fire at night and tell us stories about knights and fair maidens." The shared confidences, small as they were, created a bridge between them. As they continued their meal, Dorothy found herself telling Jack about her childhood in Pennsylvania, her father's clockmaking business, and the illness that had taken both her parents within weeks of each other. In turn, Jack spoke more about growing up on the frontier, learning ranching from his father, and the challenges of keeping the property going after his father's death. After supper, they sat together on the porch, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. The evening air was cool but not uncomfortable, fragrant with pine and sage. From somewhere in the distance came the lonesome howl of a coyote. "Will you sleep in the barn again tonight?" Dorothy asked, surprising herself with her directness. Jack glanced at her, his expression unreadable in the gathering darkness. "Would you prefer that I did?" Dorothy considered the question honestly. "I don't know," she admitted. "This is all very strange to me. We're married, yet we're strangers." "We're less strange to each other than we were yesterday," Jack pointed out. "True," Dorothy acknowledged, "but marriage is meant to be more than just sharing a roof and a name." "It is," Jack agreed, "but it doesn't all have to happen at once." He was quiet for a moment. "My parents had an arranged marriage in a way. My father went back east specifically to find a wife. They barely knew each other when they wed." He paused. "But my father told me once that he grew to love my mother slowly, like a tree growing so gradually you hardly notice it happening until one day you look up and realize it's strong enough to shelter you." The sentiment, unexpectedly poetic coming from this taciturn man, touched Dorothy deeply. "I like that idea," she said softly. They sat in silence for a while longer, the vast Wyoming night enfolding them like a blanket. When the air grew too chill to ignore, they went inside together. Jack banked the fire while Dorothy tidied the kitchen, moving around each other with a tentative awareness that was neither comfortable nor uncomfortable, simply new. When they had finished their evening tasks, they stood facing each other in the main room, the moment they had been avoiding finally upon them. "I'll sleep in the barn again tonight," Jack said quietly, "but I'd like to put my bedroll in here by the fire, if that's all right with you." The compromise seemed right, somehow acknowledging both their marriage and the fragile newness of their relationship. "Yes," Dorothy agreed. "I think that would be best for now." Jack nodded, relief evident in his posture. He fetched his bedroll from where he had left it by the door and spread it near the hearth. "Good night, Dorothy," he said as she turned toward the bedroom. "Good night, Jack," she replied, pausing in the doorway, "and thank you for everything." As she lay in bed that night, listening to the quiet sounds of Jack settling into his makeshift bed in the next room, Dorothy reflected on the strange turn her life had taken. 2 days ago, she had been a mail-order bride traveling to marry a man she knew only through letters. Now she was the wife of a Wyoming rancher, living in a cabin miles from town, learning a way of life entirely foreign to her. Yet somehow, despite all logic, it felt right. There was an honesty to Jack Reeves that had been lacking in Arthur Caldwell's carefully crafted letters. And there was a genuineness to this simple life that appealed to Dorothy's practical nature far more than Arthur's promises of town life and mercantile prosperity. Perhaps, Dorothy thought as she drifted toward sleep, this unexpected marriage would turn out to be a blessing in disguise like the tree Jack had spoken of, growing slowly but surely into something strong enough to shelter them both. The days that followed fell into a pattern as Dorothy settled into her new life at Silver Creek Ranch. Each morning, she rose with the sun to prepare breakfast while Jack tended to the animals. They would eat together, discussing the day's tasks before Jack headed out to work the ranch. Dorothy spent her mornings cleaning, cooking, and learning to manage the household. often referencing Mrs. Holloway's advice when the older woman came to help twice a week. In the afternoons, when her household duties were complete, Dorothy set up her sewing machine by the window in the main room and began taking in mending work from neighboring ranches. Word spread quickly about the new Mrs. Reeves and her skills with a needle, and soon Dorothy found herself with a steady stream of work: torn shirts to mend, trousers to patch, even the occasional dress to alter or curtains to sew. Jack, true to his word, continued to sleep by the fireplace in the main room, though they spent their evenings together on the porch or at the table, slowly getting to know one another. Dorothy learned that Jack had a dry sense of humor that emerged when he was relaxed, and a thoughtful intelligence that belied his limited formal education. Jack discovered that Dorothy had a practical mind and a determined spirit that enabled her to tackle new challenges without complaint. On the 10th day of their marriage, a spring storm rolled in from the mountains, bringing driving rain that turned the ranch yard to mud and kept them confined to the cabin. By mid-afternoon, Dorothy had completed her household tasks and was sitting at her sewing machine, working on a dress for the shopkeeper's wife in town, when Jack came in from checking the barn, soaked to the skin despite his slicker. "Storm's getting worse," he announced, hanging his dripping hat on a peg by the door. "Creek's rising fast. I've moved the stock to higher ground, but we should keep an eye on it." Dorothy rose immediately. "You're drenched. Let me heat some water for you to wash." As she busied herself at the stove, Jack stripped off his wet coat and boots. "Sorry about the mess," he said, eyeing the puddles forming on the plank floor. "Don't worry about that," Dorothy replied, bringing him a towel. "Get those wet clothes off before you catch your death." Jack disappeared into the bedroom and returned a few minutes later in dry clothes, his dark hair still damp and curling slightly at the ends. Dorothy had hot coffee waiting for him at the table. "Thank you," he said, wrapping his hands around the steaming mug. "It's turning cold out there." Dorothy nodded, noticing the slight tremor in his hands. "You're chilled through. Here, sit closer to the fire." As the afternoon wore on, the storm intensified. Rain lashed against the windows, and the wind howled around the eaves of the cabin. Jack made frequent trips to the door to check the water level in the creek, his expression growing more concerned each time. "The creek's overflowing its banks," he reported after his latest check. "If it keeps rising, we might have trouble." "What kind of trouble?" Dorothy asked, setting aside her sewing. "Flooding, mainly. The cabin's on high enough ground, but the barn and corrals are lower. And if the bridge washes out, we'll be cut off from town until I can repair it." Dorothy nodded, understanding the seriousness of the situation. "What can I do to help?" Jack looked at her with an expression she was coming to recognize, a mixture of surprise and approval. "We should prepare, just in case. Gather any valuables or important papers. Make sure we have plenty of lamp oil and food where water can't reach it." Together, they set about securing the cabin, moving items to higher shelves and gathering essentials. Jack showed Dorothy where he kept important documents: the deed to the ranch, his parents' marriage certificate, his father's military papers in a metal box under a loose floorboard in the bedroom. "These need to stay dry no matter what," he said, handing her the box. "And there's something else in there you should have." Dorothy opened the box and among the papers found a small velvet pouch. Inside was a simple gold ring set with a single pearl. "It was my mother's," Jack explained, watching her face. "My father gave it to her when they married. I thought, well, if you wanted." Dorothy looked up at him, touched by the gesture. "It's beautiful, Jack. Are you sure?" He nodded. "You're my wife. It seems right that you should have it." Dorothy slipped the ring onto her finger where it fit as if made for her. "Thank you," she said softly. "I'll treasure it." Their eyes met and held for a long moment, something unspoken passing between them. Then a particularly loud crack of thunder broke the spell, and Jack turned back to their preparations. As evening approached, the storm showed no signs of abating. The creek had risen to within yards of the barn, and Jack had moved the horses to the relative safety of the cabin's covered porch. He had just returned from checking on them when a pounding at the door startled them both. Jack opened it to find a drenched rider outside, water streaming from his hat and coat. Reeves, thank God you're home. Wilson. Jack stepped back to let the man enter. What in blazes are you doing out in this weather? The newcomer, a rancher from a neighboring property whom Dorothy had met briefly at the general store, shook water from his hat. The Henderson place is flooding bad. Creek's already taken their barn and it's rising fast toward the house. They've got the little ones up in the loft, but they need help getting out. Jack was already reaching for his coat. How many? Joe and Martha, their 4 kids and Martha's mother. The oldest boy broke his leg last week, so he can't ride. I'll saddle up, Jack said grimly. You go on ahead and tell them help's coming. Wilson nodded, then seemed to notice Dorothy for the first time. Madam, he acknowledged with a quick nod before hurrying back out into the storm. Jack turned to Dorothy, his expression serious. I have to go. Of course you do, she agreed immediately. What can I do? Stay here. Keep the lamps lit so I can find my way back. He paused. If the water reaches the porch steps, take what you can and go to higher ground. The ridge behind the house should be safe. Dorothy nodded, trying to hide her fear. Be careful, Jack. He looked at her for a long moment, then did something he had never done before. He stepped forward and kissed her, briefly but firmly, on the lips. I will, he promised, then was gone into the howling night. Left alone, Dorothy kept busy to stave off worry. She stoked the fire, prepared a pot of stew that would keep warm for Jack's return, and gathered blankets and dry clothes for the Henderson family, should Jack bring them back to the cabin. Outside, the storm raged on, the wind driving the rain horizontally against the windows. Hours passed with no sign of Jack. Dorothy found herself moving restlessly from window to door, straining to see through the darkness and rain. The creek had risen further, now lapping at the edge of the yard, but the cabin remained safely above the water line. Just when her anxiety was becoming unbearable, she heard the sound of horses approaching. Dorothy flung open the door, holding a lamp high, and saw Jack leading a procession of riders through the rain, a man and woman on one horse, an elderly woman clinging to another rider, and 2 small children sharing a third mount. Jack himself had a boy of about 12 cradled before him on his saddle. Dorothy, he called over the storm. Help me get them inside. The next hour was a blur of activity as Dorothy helped the bedraggled Henderson family into the cabin. Martha Henderson was pale with exhaustion and fear, her 4 children ranging from 5 to 12 wide-eyed and trembling. Mrs. Henderson's mother, a frail woman in her 70s, collapsed into a chair by the fire, coughing weakly. Our house, Martha kept saying, her voice hollow with shock. The water just kept coming and coming. You're safe now, Dorothy assured her, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders. That's what matters. Jack and Joe Henderson made one more trip out into the storm to bring the horses under the shelter of the cabin's eaves, then rejoined the group inside. Jack was soaked through again, his face drawn with fatigue, but his eyes sought Dorothy's immediately. Everyone all right? He asked. Dorothy nodded. I've got stew keeping warm, and I've laid out dry clothes. The children can take the bed, and we'll make pallets by the fire for the rest. Jack's expression softened. You've thought of everything. The cramped cabin soon settled into a semblance of order. The children, dried and fed, fell asleep almost immediately in the big bed in the bedroom. Martha and her mother took pallets near the fire, while Joe slept sitting up in a chair, unwilling to relax his vigilance completely. Jack and Dorothy moved quietly around them, providing what comfort they could. It was well past midnight when they finally had a moment alone, standing together at the window, watching the rain continue to fall. Will their home be lost? Dorothy asked softly. Jack shook his head. Hard to say until daylight. The cabin's built on stone foundations, so it might stand, but they'll have lost most of their possessions. At least they're all safe, Dorothy said. Thanks to you, Jack glanced at her. And you've been amazing tonight, Dorothy, taking charge, making everyone comfortable. Not every woman would handle a crisis so well. The compliment warmed her more than she would have expected. I'm just doing what needs to be done. That's what makes you special, Jack said quietly. You see what needs doing and you do it without complaint or dramatics. It's a rare quality. Dorothy felt a blush rising to her cheeks. You should try to get some rest, she said, changing the subject. You must be exhausted. Jack nodded, acknowledging his fatigue. There's not much room left, he observed, looking around the crowded cabin. We could share the porch rocker, Dorothy suggested. It's wide enough for two, and we'd hear if anyone needed anything. They settled into the rocking chair on the covered porch, a blanket spread across their laps against the night's chill. The storm had lessened somewhat, the rain falling more steadily now without the earlier violence. In the distance, lightning still flickered occasionally, illuminating the flooded landscape. I was worried about you, Dorothy admitted, her voice barely audible above the patter of rain. Jack's arm, which had been resting along the back of the chair, came down to encircle her shoulders. I'm sorry. It took longer than I expected to get everyone out safely. Dorothy leaned into his warmth, allowing herself to accept the comfort of his presence. I kept thinking about your kiss, she confessed, and how I'd never get to tell you that I liked it. In the darkness, she felt rather than saw Jack turn toward her. Did you? Yes, she whispered. His hand came up to cup her cheek, turning her face toward his. I've wanted to kiss you since that first day in the church, he said, his voice low and rough. You looked so brave, standing there alone, so strong. Dorothy's heart quickened. I didn't feel strong. But you were, Jack insisted. You are. His lips found hers in the darkness, gentle at first, then with growing confidence as she responded. Dorothy's arms slipped around his neck, drawing him closer as the kiss deepened. All the tension and fear of the evening seemed to dissolve, replaced by a warmth that spread through her entire body. When they finally broke apart, Jack rested his forehead against hers. I think I'm falling in love with you, Dorothy Reeves, he whispered. I never expected that to happen so quickly. Dorothy's breath caught in her throat. I think I'm falling in love with you too, she admitted. Is that strange when we've known each other such a short time? Jack shook his head. My father always said that some trees grow faster than others, depending on the soil and the sun. Maybe some love is like that too. Dorothy smiled at the continuation of his earlier metaphor. Then I think our tree is growing very well indeed. They stayed on the porch until dawn, talking softly, sharing occasional kisses, and watching as the storm gradually abated and the first light of day revealed a transformed landscape. The creek had receded somewhat during the night, though much of the lower pastureland remained underwater. The bridge, miraculously, was still standing, though debris had collected against its supports. As the Henderson family began to stir inside, Jack squeezed Dorothy's hand. No matter what damage we find today, I'm grateful for last night, he said quietly. Dorothy understood what he meant. The crisis had accelerated their relationship, breaking down barriers that might have taken weeks or months to overcome otherwise. So am I, she replied. The next few days were busy ones at Silver Creek Ranch. The Hendersons remained with them until their own home could be assessed and cleaned. As Jack had predicted, the stone foundation had kept the cabin from washing away, but the interior was mud-coated and most of their possessions ruined. Dorothy organized the women of neighboring ranches into a cleaning brigade, while Jack and other men repaired damaged structures and fences. Throughout it all, Dorothy and Jack worked as a team, their new understanding creating a seamless partnership that others noticed and commented on. By the time the Hendersons were able to return to their home a week later, Dorothy and Jack had fully embraced their roles as husband and wife, sharing not only the cabin's responsibilities, but also its single bed. On the evening after the Hendersons departed, Dorothy and Jack sat together on the porch, her head resting comfortably on his shoulder as they watched the sunset paint the western sky in shades of gold and crimson. I was thinking, Jack said, his fingers idly playing with her hair which she had left loose after washing it earlier. It's been nearly 3 weeks since our wedding. Dorothy nodded, remembering his promise that she could leave after a month if she wished. So it has. Are you happy here, Dorothy? He asked, a hint of vulnerability in his voice. With me, Dorothy turned to look at him, seeing in his face the boy who had lost his mother, the young man who had failed to protect his sister, and the man who had rescued her from humiliation and given her a home. Happier than I ever expected to be, she answered truthfully. This place, this life, it suits me far better than I could have imagined. relief and joy spread across Jack's features. "I was afraid you might still be thinking of leaving when the month was up." Dorothy shook her head. "I stopped thinking about leaving the night of the storm," she admitted. "When I realized I was more afraid of losing you than of the flood." Jack pulled her closer, pressing a kiss to her temple. "I love you, Dorothy Reeves. And I promise to spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret staying." "I love you too, Jack," Dorothy replied, marveling at how natural the words felt. "And I promise to be the wife you deserve, one who stands beside you through whatever storms may come." As the last light faded from the sky and the first stars appeared, Dorothy reflected on the strange journey that had brought her to this moment. She had come west seeking security and found love instead, not with the man who had promised her prosperity in his letters, but with the quiet cowboy who had stood beside her when she needed him most. It wasn't the life she had planned, but as Jack's arms encircled her in the gathering darkness, Dorothy knew with absolute certainty that it was the life she was meant to have. Fall settled over Silver Creek Ranch with a blaze of color and the crisp promise of winter to come. The aspen groves turned golden, the nights grew longer, and the mountains to the west occasionally sported a dusting of snow on their highest peaks. Dorothy had embraced her role as a rancher's wife with enthusiasm and determination, learning new skills and adapting her Eastern sensibilities to the realities of frontier life. October brought the cattle drive, a week-long absence for Jack as he and two hired hands drove the year's calves to market in Cheyenne. Dorothy saw him off with a brave face, hiding her anxiety at being left alone on the ranch for the first time. "I've stocked the pantry, and Mrs. Holloway will stop by every other day," Jack assured her as he prepared to leave. "Wilson's place is just over the ridge if you need anything urgent." "I'll be fine," Dorothy promised, straightening his collar. "It's only a week." Jack pulled her close, his expression serious. "I hate leaving you." "It's part of ranching life," Dorothy replied practically. "I knew what I was getting into when I fell in love with a cowboy." He smiled at that, the worry in his eyes softening. "When I get back, we'll have money for those improvements you've been wanting to make to the cabin." Dorothy nodded, already planning how she would use the cattle money to add curtains to the windows, a proper rug for the main room, and perhaps some comfortable chairs to replace the rough-hewn bench by the fire. "Just come back safely," she said. "That's all I care about." The week of Jack's absence passed more quickly than Dorothy had feared. She kept busy with her sewing work, which had grown into a profitable sideline, and with preparing the cabin for the coming winter. Mrs. Holloway's visits provided company and assistance with some of the heavier tasks, and Dorothy found she enjoyed the quiet evenings alone with a book more than she had expected. Still, when she heard the sound of approaching horses on the 7th day, Dorothy abandoned the bread dough she was kneading and ran to the door, her heart racing with anticipation. Jack dismounted with fluid grace and strode toward her, his face alight with pleasure at the sight of her waiting. "Welcome home," Dorothy called, unable to contain her joy. Jack swept her into his arms, lifting her off her feet in an exuberant embrace. "God, I've missed you," he murmured against her hair. That night, after the hired hands had been fed and sent on their way with their pay, Jack and Dorothy sat at the table counting the proceeds from the cattle sale. It was a good sum better than Jack had expected, given the prices in Cheyenne. "We can put some aside for next year's expenses and still have plenty for improvements," Jack said, separating the money into neat piles. "What would you like to do first?" Dorothy considered the question. "The curtains and rugs, of course, but I've been thinking, what if we added another room?" "Not now, but perhaps in the spring." Jack looked up, surprised. "Another room? What for?" Dorothy smiled, a touch of shyness in her expression. "For a nursery, perhaps, eventually." Jack's eyes widened as he understood her meaning. "Dorothy, are you saying no, not yet?" she clarified quickly. "But someday, I hope, and it would be good to be prepared." Jack's face softened with emotion. "A family," he said quietly. "I'd like that very much." Dorothy reached across the table to take his hand. "So would I." "This is a good place to raise children, open skies, fresh air, and parents who love each other." Jack squeezed her hand, his eyes suspiciously bright. "You continue to amaze me, Dorothy Reeves. Every day I think I couldn't possibly love you more, and then I do." The winter of 1875-76 proved to be particularly harsh, with heavy snowfalls and bitter winds that howled around the cabin's eaves and drifted snow against its walls. Dorothy and Jack spent the long evenings planning their future, the addition to the cabin, the improvements to the ranch, the family they hoped to have. By spring, Dorothy was sewing tiny garments in the evenings, her face glowing with the secret joy of impending motherhood. Jack, upon learning of the expected arrival in late summer, set to work immediately on the promised nursery addition, recruiting neighbors to help raise the walls in an old-fashioned building B that brought the scattered ranching community together. As Dorothy's pregnancy progressed, so did the changes to Silver Creek Ranch. The cabin grew by one snug room, its windows framed by Dorothy's handmade curtains. A proper stone path now led from the door to the barn, making walking safer in all weather. Inside, the main room boasted comfortable chairs, colorful rugs, and shelves filled with books and treasured objects, a blend of Jack's practical frontier aesthetic and Dorothy's Eastern refinement. On a sweltering August evening with Mrs. Holloway and the doctor from town in attendance, Dorothy gave birth to a healthy baby boy whom they named James, after Jack's father. As she cradled her son in her arms, Dorothy looked up at Jack's awestruck face and felt a wave of contentment wash over her. "He's perfect," Jack whispered, one finger gently stroking the baby's downy head. "He is," Dorothy agreed. "Our little miracle." Life settled into a new pattern with James's arrival. The rhythm of ranch work continued, cattle to tend, crops to harvest, preparations for winter, but now there was the added joy of watching their son grow and develop. Dorothy managed to balance her roles as mother, wife, and seamstress with remarkable grace, though there were days when Jack found her asleep in her chair. Baby James nestled against her chest, her sewing forgotten in her lap. By the time James celebrated his first birthday, Dorothy was teaching him to toddle around the cabin, his pudgy hands gripping her fingers for support. Jack, watching from the doorway after a day of fence mending, felt his heart swell with a happiness he had never thought possible. "He's going to be as stubborn as his mother," Jack observed as James determinedly pulled himself up after a tumble. Dorothy smiled. "And as strong as his father." James grew quickly, his babyhood seemed to pass in the blink of an eye. Soon he was running across the yard, helping Jack with simple chores, and riding his own pony, a gentle old mare that Jack had trained specially for him. Dorothy watched her son's growing independence with pride tinged with wistfulness, already missing the baby he had been even as she delighted in the boy he was becoming. When James was 4, Dorothy gave birth to their second child, a daughter they named Sarah, in honor of Jack's long-lost sister. Little Sarah had her mother's green eyes and her father's quiet determination, and from the moment she could walk, she followed her big brother everywhere, much to James's occasional annoyance and secret pride. The winter that Sarah turned 2 brought an unexpected visitor to Silver Creek Ranch. Jack was in the barn, repairing harnesses by lantern light, when he heard the sound of an approaching wagon, unusual in the deep cold of January. Stepping outside, he saw a battered rig making its way slowly up the lane, driven by a bundled figure he couldn't immediately identify. By the time the wagon reached the yard, Dorothy had joined Jack on the porch, wrapping a shawl tightly around her against the bitter cold. "Who is it?" she asked, peering through the gathering darkness. Jack shook his head. "Can't tell." "Stay here while But before he could finish, the driver had climbed down from the wagon and approached the porch, pushing back the hood of a threadbare coat to reveal the face of a woman perhaps in her 30s, careworn and pale, but with eyes that Jack would have recognized anywhere. "Sarah." He breathed, disbelief evident in his voice. The woman nodded, tears already forming in her eyes. "Hello, Jack, it's been a long time." For a moment, Jack stood frozen, a tumult of emotions crossing his face: shock, joy, anger, relief. Then he was down the porch steps in 2 strides, enfolding his sister in an embrace that spoke of years of worry and longing. Dorothy watched, her own eyes filling with tears at the reunion she had heard so much about but never truly expected to witness. When Jack finally released his sister, he turned to Dorothy with a face transformed by joy. "Dorothy, this is my sister, Sarah. Sarah, this is my wife, Dorothy." Sarah smiled tentatively at Dorothy. "Jack wrote to me about you, about both of you. I hope it's not presumptuous to just arrive like this." "Not at all," Dorothy assured her, coming down the steps to embrace her sister-in-law. "Your family, you're always welcome here." It was only then that they noticed the small face peering out from the wagon, a girl of perhaps 7 or 8, with Sarah's dark hair and solemn eyes. "And who might this be?" Jack asked gently. Sarah's expression softened. "That's my daughter, Emma." "Emma, come meet your Uncle Jack and Aunt Dorothy." The child climbed down hesitantly, staying close to her mother's side as introductions were made. Dorothy, noticing the girl's shivers, quickly ushered everyone inside, where the warmth of the fire and the delicious aroma of the stew simmering on the stove created an immediate atmosphere of comfort. While Jack carried in Sarah and Emma's sparse belongings, Dorothy settled them at the table, pouring hot coffee for Sarah and warm milk for Emma. Little James and Sarah, awakened by the commotion, peeked shyly at their newfound cousin from behind Dorothy's skirts. Over supper, Sarah's story emerged in pieces. Her marriage to the gambler had indeed taken her to California, where they had lived a precarious existence dependent on his fluctuating fortunes. Emma had been born in San Francisco, but shortly after her birth, Sarah's husband had abandoned them, leaving Sarah to support herself and her daughter alone. "I tried to make it work," Sarah explained, her hands cradling her coffee cup as if drawing strength from its warmth. "I took in washing, worked as a hotel maid, did whatever I could, but it was never enough." She looked up at Jack, her eyes filled with regret. "You were right about him, Jack. I should have listened." Jack shook his head. "That doesn't matter now. What matters is that you're here, both of you, safe." "We won't be a burden," Sarah promised. "I can work. I'm good with a needle and I can cook and clean. Once we've rested a bit, we'll find a place of our own." "Nonsense," Dorothy interjected firmly. "This is your home for as long as you want it to be. We have the space, and I could use the help with the children and my sewing business." Jack nodded in agreement. "Dorothy's right. You belong here, Sarah. Both of you do." That night, with Sarah and Emma settled in the nursery, James happily agreeing to share his parents' room for the time being, Jack and Dorothy lay in bed talking quietly. "I can't believe she's really here," Jack said, his voice filled with wonder. "After all these years." Dorothy snuggled closer to him. "It's like a miracle, and Emma, she has your eyes, Jack. Does she?" He seemed pleased by the observation. "I was so caught up in seeing Sarah again, I hardly noticed. They both look exhausted and half-starved," Dorothy noted, "but we'll soon fix that. Good food, clean air, and love, that's what they need." Jack pressed a kiss to her forehead. "You're remarkable, you know that, taking in my long-lost sister and her child without a moment's hesitation." "They're family," Dorothy said simply. "Besides, you took in a complete stranger and married her on the spot. This seems rather less dramatic by comparison," Jack chuckled. "When you put it that way, I suppose you're right." His expression grew serious. "Thank you, Dorothy, for everything." "No need for thanks," she murmured, already drifting toward sleep. "We're building a life together, Jack, a family, that's what matters." Sarah and Emma's arrival brought new energy to Silver Creek Ranch. After an initial period of adjustment, Sarah proved to be an invaluable help with both the household and Dorothy's expanding sewing business. Emma, once she overcame her initial shyness, became an enthusiastic playmate for James and little Sarah, her city experiences adding new dimensions to their games. By summer, Jack had built another addition to the cabin, a bedroom for Sarah and Emma, giving everyone their own space again. The ranch prospered, with good rainfall producing abundant grass for the cattle and a bountiful vegetable garden. Dorothy's sewing business had grown to the point where she and Sarah were considering purchasing a second machine to keep up with orders. One evening in late July, as the family sat on the porch watching the sunset, Jack cleared his throat. "I've been thinking," he began, a hint of nervousness in his voice. "It's been nearly 2 years since we've had a proper celebration." Dorothy glanced at him curiously. "What kind of celebration did you have in mind?" "A wedding," Jack replied, his eyes meeting Sarah's across the porch. "Sarah's been corresponding with Thomas Wilson for months now. I think it's time we made it official." Sarah blushed, but her smile was radiant. "Jack, I was going to tell everyone at supper." Thomas Wilson, the middle-aged widower from the neighboring ranch who had helped during the flood years before, had been a regular visitor since Sarah's arrival. His growing affection for Sarah had been obvious to everyone, as had Sarah's blooming happiness in his company. "Thomas asked for my blessing last week," Jack continued. "I gave it, of course, but I thought you might like a proper wedding this time, Sarah, here at the ranch with family and friends." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "I would love that," she said softly. "Thank you, Jack." And so, on a perfect September day in 1881, Sarah Reeves married Thomas Wilson under an arch of autumn flowers in the front yard of Silver Creek Ranch. Emma, James, and little Sarah scattered wildflower petals along the path, while Dorothy, heavily pregnant with her third child, stood as Sarah's matron of honor. Jack, prouder than anyone had ever seen him, walked his sister down the makeshift aisle to where Thomas waited, his weathered face alight with joy. As Dorothy watched the ceremony, her hand resting on her swollen belly, she couldn't help but reflect on her own unusual wedding day 6 years earlier. From the disaster of Arthur Caldwell's abandonment had come the greatest blessing of her life: a husband who cherished her, children who delighted her, and a home filled with love and laughter. After the wedding feast, as twilight settled over the ranch and the guests began to depart, Jack found Dorothy sitting alone on the porch, watching the first stars appear in the darkening sky. "Tired?" he asked, settling beside her. Dorothy smiled, leaning into his embrace. "A little, but happy." "It was a beautiful wedding." "It was," Jack agreed, "though not as memorable as ours." Dorothy laughed softly. "That's certainly true. I doubt many couples can say they met and married within the same hour." Jack's arm tightened around her. "Best impulsive decision I ever made." "Mine too," Dorothy admitted, placing her hand over his where it rested on her shoulder. "I came west looking for security and found love instead." "And I was looking for a practical arrangement and found the other half of my soul," Jack countered, pressing a kiss to her temple. They sat in companionable silence for a while, watching the moon rise over the distant mountains. Dorothy felt the baby move within her, a gentle reminder of the future they were building together. "Jack," she said softly, "do you ever wonder what happened to Arthur Caldwell?" Jack considered the question. "Sometimes. Last I heard, he'd moved on to Denver after his business failed here." Dorothy nodded. "I used to think I'd never forgive him for what he did to me, but now—" She paused, looking up at the man beside her. "Now I think I should thank him. If he had shown up that day, I'd never have known what real love feels like." Jack's eyes, still as blue and clear as they had been the day they met, searched her face in the moonlight. "Are you happy, Dorothy, truly happy with this life?" Dorothy thought of their cozy cabin, expanded now to accommodate their growing family, of the ranch, thriving under Jack's careful stewardship, of their children, strong and healthy and wild as the Wyoming wind. She thought of the journey that had brought her here from the cramped tenements of Boston to this vast, open country where she had found not just a home, but a purpose and a love beyond anything she had dared to dream. "Happier than I ever imagined possible," she answered truthfully. "This life, our life, is better than any story I could have written for myself." Jack smiled, the lines around his eyes crinkling in the way she had come to love. "Then I'd say we've both been blessed beyond measure." As the moon climbed higher in the night sky, casting silver light over Silver Creek Ranch, Dorothy Reeves rested in her husband's arms, content in the knowledge that sometimes the greatest love stories begin with the most unexpected circumstances, like a mail-order bride abandoned on her wedding day, and the cowboy who stood beside her instead. 2 weeks after Sarah's wedding, Dorothy gave birth to a healthy baby boy they named Thomas. in honor of their new brother-in-law. Jack, now an experienced father, took over much of the care of James and little Sarah during Dorothy's recovery, proving himself as adept at braiding his daughter's hair as he was at mending fences. As the years passed, Silver Creek Ranch continued to prosper. Jack and Dorothy added more land to their holdings when a neighboring rancher decided to sell out and head to California. Their cattle herd grew, as did their reputation for fair dealing and quality stock. Dorothy's sewing business evolved into a small dressmaking shop in town, run primarily by Sarah Wilson, who showed a remarkable talent for design. James, their firstborn, grew into a thoughtful young man with his father's skill with horses and his mother's head for business. By the time he was 15, he was handling much of the day-to-day ranch operations alongside Jack, freeing his father to focus on expanding their breeding program. Little Sarah, no longer so little, developed her mother's skill with a needle and her father's quiet determination, often accompanying Dorothy to town to help in the shop. Thomas, the baby of the family, was perhaps the most surprising a born scholar who devoured books as quickly as Dorothy could obtain them, and showed an aptitude for mathematics that impressed even the schoolteacher in town. Jack and Dorothy began discussing the possibility of sending him to college in Denver. When the time came, an opportunity neither of them had enjoyed, but were determined to provide for their children if they wanted it. Through it all, Dorothy and Jack's partnership remained the strong foundation upon which their family life was built. They had their disagreements. Of course, Dorothy's insistence on sending all three children to the town school rather than educating them solely at home had led to several spirited debates, but they always found their way back to common ground, their respect for each other never wavering. In the spring of 1890, as Dorothy approached her 37th birthday, Jack surprised her with an invitation to a dance in town, a rare treat, as social occasions were few and far between in their busy lives. "A dance," Dorothy repeated, looking up from the sock she was darning. "What's the occasion?" Jack smiled mysteriously. "Do I need an occasion to take my wife dancing?" Dorothy raised an eyebrow, knowing her husband too well to believe this was a spontaneous suggestion. "Jack Reeves, what are you planning?" he laughed, holding up his hands in surrender. "Can't keep anything from you, can I? All right, there's a reason. It's our 15th wedding anniversary next week." Dorothy's eyes widened. With the children's activities and the spring calving, she had lost track of the date. "So it is. 15 years. 15 years since I saw the most beautiful woman in Wyoming standing alone at the altar and decided to do something about it," Jack said, his eyes warming with the memory. Dorothy set aside her darning and crossed to where he stood, wrapping her arms around his waist. Though 15 years had added a touch of silver to his dark hair and etched fine lines around his eyes, he was still as handsome to her as he had been that first day. "I can't believe you remembered when I forgot," she said, feeling a pang of guilt. Jack pressed a kiss to her forehead. "I remember everything about that day, Dorothy. The way you held your head up despite everything, the way you looked at me like I was either a savior or a madman." "A bit of both, perhaps," Dorothy teased, resting her head against his chest. "I thought you were the most forward man I'd ever met, proposing marriage to a complete stranger. And I thought you were the bravest woman I'd ever seen, accepting such a proposal." Jack's arms tightened around her. "I fell in love with you that very day, you know. I just didn't recognize it yet." Dorothy looked up at him, touched by the admission. "It took me a bit longer until the flood, I think, when I thought I might lose you to the storm. So, will you do me the honor of attending the dance with me, Mrs. Reeves?" Jack asked formally, though his eyes twinkled with mischief. "I promise not to step on your toes too often," Dorothy laughed. "I would be delighted, Mr. Reeves, though after 15 years of marriage and 3 children, I think you've earned the right to step on my toes as much as you like." The evening of the dance arrived clear and mild, with the promise of summer in the air. Dorothy wore her best dress, a deep blue silk that Jack had ordered from Denver the previous Christmas, and pinned her hair up in a style more elaborate than her usual practical arrangement. Jack, handsome in his Sunday suit with his hair freshly trimmed, stared at her as if seeing her for the first time. "You look beautiful," he said simply, offering her his arm. The town hall was decorated with spring flowers and lanterns, a small band playing in the corner. Many of their friends and neighbors were already there, including Sarah and Thomas Wilson with their 2 young sons. Dorothy was immediately drawn into conversation with the other women, while Jack joined a group of men discussing the prospects for the summer's grazing. As the evening progressed, Dorothy found herself enjoying the rare opportunity to socialize. They had both been so focused on building their ranch and raising their family that occasions like this had become infrequent treats rather than regular occurrences. When the band struck up a waltz, Jack appeared at her side, extending his hand with a formal bow. "May I have this dance, Mrs. Reeves?" Dorothy placed her hand in his, smiling up at him. "You may, Mr. Reeves." As Jack led her onto the dance floor, Dorothy was reminded of how naturally they moved together, in dance as in life. Years of partnership had created an instinctive understanding between them, each anticipating the other's movements, supporting and complementing rather than leading or following. "Do you remember teaching me to waltz?" Dorothy asked as they circled the floor. "That first summer when you were determined I should know how to dance properly for the Harvest Festival," Jack grinned at the memory. "You were a quick study, as you were with everything about ranch life." "I had a good teacher," Dorothy replied, "patient and thorough." "I had a good reason to be patient," Jack said, his voice dropping to a more intimate tone. "I was already half in love with my pupil." As the waltz ended, Jack surprised her by leading her not back to their table but toward the doors that opened onto the small town square. Outside, the night was clear and star-filled, the spring air sweet with the scent of blooming lilacs. "I have something for you," Jack said, reaching into his pocket. "An anniversary gift." He handed her a small velvet box similar to the one that had contained his mother's ring 15 years earlier. Inside, Dorothy found a delicate gold locket on a fine chain. "Jack, it's beautiful," she breathed, touching the locket gently. "Open it," he urged. Inside were 2 tiny photographs, one of Jack, the other of their 3 children grouped together, their faces solemn in the formal pose required by the photographer's long exposure time. "So you'll always have us close to your heart," Jack explained, taking the locket from her hands to fasten it around her neck. "Even when we're driving you to distraction." Dorothy laughed softly, her fingers touching the locket where it rested against her skin. "As if I could ever forget any of you for a moment." Jack's hands lingered at her neck, then moved to cup her face. 15 years ago, I made the best decision of my life standing up in that church. I've never regretted it, not for a single day." "Nor have I," Dorothy replied, her voice husky with emotion. "Even on the days when the roof leaked and the cattle broke through the fence and the children were all sick at once," Jack laughed. Even then," she confirmed. "Because at the end of those days, there was always you, steady as the mountains, ready to face whatever came next alongside me." Jack drew her closer, his kiss tender yet possessive, the kiss of a man who knew exactly how precious was the woman in his arms. When they finally parted, he rested his forehead against hers, a gesture that had become familiar over their years together. "I love you, Dorothy Reeves," he said simply. "More today than yesterday and not as much as I will tomorrow." "And I love you, Jack Reeves," she replied. "My unexpected husband, my dearest friend, my heart's true home." They returned to the dance with fingers intertwined, rejoining the celebration with the quiet joy of a couple who had discovered that the greatest adventure was not the wild frontier itself, but the life they had built together upon it. Years later, when their grandchildren would ask how they met, Dorothy would smile at Jack across the crowded family table and begin the story that had become a family legend. "I was a mail-order bride, you see, abandoned at the altar on my wedding day until a cowboy I'd never met stood beside me instead." And Jack, his hair now fully silver but his blue eyes as clear and steady as ever, would finish for her. "And it was the luckiest day of my life, finding the woman who would become my wife, the mother of my children, and the heart of our home." In the end, what had begun as an act of impulse, A stranger's kindness to a woman in distress had grown like Jack's metaphorical tree into something strong and enduring. A love that had weathered every storm, sheltered 3 children to adulthood, and continued to bear fruit in the lives of all it touched. For Dorothy Ainsworth Reeves, the journey west had brought her not the security of a shopkeeper's wife that she had sought, but something far more precious: a true partnership, a family bound by love rather than mere convention, and the deep satisfaction of a life well lived on the land she had come to cherish as fiercely as the man with whom she shared it. And for Jack Reeves, the impulsive decision to stand beside an abandoned bride had given him everything he hadn't known. He was seeking not just a helpmate for his ranch, but a companion for his soul, a mother for his children, and a love that had transformed his solitary existence into a life rich with connection and purpose. Together, they had written a love story more authentic and enduring than any either could have imagined on that spring day in 1875, when fate and courage had brought them together in a small Wyoming church, proving that sometimes the most unexpected beginnings lead to the most beautiful destinies.